Dear brothers and sisters, today we commemorate the memory of all the holy new martyrs and confessors of Russia. In fact, we could extend that commemoration to all the new martyrs and confessors who suffered in the 20th century under the yoke of the communists, Bolsheviks, and atheists. For their suffering was truly real. Something that we can't imagine. In the Soviet Union alone, more than 500,000 people perished simply because they believed in God and because they wanted to live their life according to their faith. Because they placed God first, because God was the center of their life, because they longed for the heavenly Jerusalem, because they accepted only God's truth. But you see, all of this was contrary to what society at that time was teaching them. And because of that, they suffered. It is unknown how many languished in prison, in exile. Parents were separated from their children. Fathers were sent to labor camps. Churches were closed, destroyed. In St. Petersburg alone, before the revolution in 1917, there were 600 churches. By the 1980s, there were 13. Churches were reformed into horrible things, into stables, restaurants, public lavatories, ice rinks, clubs. Some were even transformed into metro stations. Most, however, were completely destroyed. The atheists wanted to remove any reminders of God from the minds of everyday people. And people resisted out of love for God. They resisted by not giving in to the false teachings. They resisted by striving to preserve the faith, by defending the rights of the clergy and the faithful, by standing up for the preservation of their churches. Hundreds of priests and bishops in the first years of the revolution were simply killed. And today, you may ask, why on this Sunday do we commemorate all of the holy new martyrs? The Church, on the Sunday closest to February 7th, keeps the memory of the holy martyrs because on February 7th, January 25th on the old calendar, the holy new martyr Vladimir, Metropolitan of Kiev, was martyred in 1918. He was the first hierarch to suffer at the hands of the atheists. The first clergy, the first priest to suffer. was just 6 days after the Russian Revolution. The holy higher martyr John Kachurov, who was serving in the outskirts of St. Petersburg in Tsarskaya Selo, and after divine liturgy was arrested and taken away and shot, only because he organized a procession, a church procession, to pray for peace. St. John Kachurov is close to us in America because he served here as a priest at the turn of the 20th century. He was the founder of the parish in Chicago and ultimately the pastor during the time when they built the cathedral in Chicago, which stands still today. His icon is in our church. Of course, St. Tikhon, patriarch, who perished in 1925 on the Feast of the Annunciation, likewise served here at the turn of the 20th century and was close friends with Father John Kachurov. And when he returned to Russia, eventually became patriarch, he stood up against the Bolsheviks and atheists and convicted them in their falsehood and hatred. And ultimately, he died. Many people think he was poisoned. Society at that time went to war against God, went to war against the church, because the church always teaches that God is the center of our life. He is the purpose of our existence, and His truth is eternal and does not change. Whether the year is 2024 or the year 100, God's truth is eternal. St. Paul says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Everyday people, like us, were persecuted because of faith. They were arrested. They lost their housing. They were fired from their jobs. They were expelled from school. Many families were separated out of hatred for God. But we commemorate them today, not to remember the evil that was enacted against them, but we commemorate them today to inspire us to follow their example. Because they lived the words of St. Paul in today's second epistle reading. For nothing can separate us from the love of Christ, neither tribulation or distress or persecution or nakedness or abandonment, neither death can separate us from the love of Christ. All of these new martyrs and confessors in the faith, as St. Paul says, conformed to the image of God's Son. And that image is an image of love and humility, an image of righteousness and truth, an image of faithfulness and trust, an image of mercy and compassion, an image of longing to always be in union with God. And it didn't matter for them whether they were imprisoned, whether they lost their jobs, whether they were hungry and impoverished. It didn't matter if they were sick and couldn't get any kind of treatment. It didn't matter if they lost all their means, being separated from each other, because they loved God first and foremost. That was most important. And they understood that God is the source of life, and God is our salvation. And for us, we are good at making excuses why we don't pray, why we don't go to church, why it's been years since we actually opened the Bible. Because we list the whole litany of reasons. And they don't even compare in a fraction of what the holy martyrs had to endure. But yet they persevered. I guess it all comes down to the fact of what do we place as the goal of our life. If we place the goal of our life to be happiness, earthly pleasures, comfort, then, of course, we would do anything and everything to preserve those things. We would even abandon the faith. But if we place as the goal of our life to learn how to be citizens of paradise, and in that we take up our cross, we deny ourselves, we follow the commandments, and we strive with all our heart to love God, then nothing can separate us from that. We understand that all the suffering in this life is just temporary. And the fathers of the church even instruct us that through these difficulties, we can grow in our faith. Because St. John of Kronstadt reminds us that just as gold is purified in fire, our faith is purified in the fire of suffering. And our faith is precious, far more precious than gold. So let us, brothers and sisters, when we endure difficulties, sickness, sorrow, loss, poverty, when we are abandoned, when we are forgotten, when we are insulted, let us always remember the words of St. Paul. Nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. Christ who is merciful, Christ who is loving, Christ who saves us and delivers us from death and opens to us the gates of paradise. As Christ says in today's second gospel reading, persevere to the end and preserve your souls.